Welcome to A Scientist Walks Into a Bar. I'm your host, Amanda Thomas, and today we're going to be talking about some new ideas about a very old disease. Cancer has probably touched your life in some way, but did you know that it's been around a long time? Like a really long time. Like since the beginning of multicellular life. If we look at it from the perspective that it has evolved along with all life on Earth, then maybe that can help us manage it a little bit better. Today's guest is Dr. Athena Aktipis, and she has written a book called The Cheating Cell: How Evolution Helps Us Understand and Treat Cancer. Athena is also an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Arizona State University. She was supposed to speak at one of our Science on Tap events here in Portland at the beginning of May, but that suddenly changed, so we're doing a podcast interview instead. She and I were both recording from the comfort and safety of our homes, which means that you might just hear her kids or my cats in the background. I hope it's not too distracting. I want to say a special thank you to Princeton University Press for their support of this podcast and our live events, and for putting us in touch with Athena in the first place. Princeton is offering a 20% discount and free shipping on copies of The Cheating Cell when you purchase it from their website using a discount code. And I'll put that link and the code in the episode notes. With that, here's the interview. So we are here today with Athena Aktipis, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Arizona State University, and she is the author of The Cheating Cell: How Evolution Helps Us Understand and Treat Cancer. So welcome, Athena.
Thank you so much for having me.
So glad you could be here. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and your research and why you wrote this book?
Yes, so I'm Athena Aktipis, and I work on cooperation across systems. So everything from how humans cooperate in small-scale societies to how the cells in our body cooperate to make us function. And I'm particularly interested in what happens in the body when that cooperation breaks down and you get what I call cellular cheating, where cells are essentially exploiting and taking advantage of the cooperation of the body. So that is the basis really for my book, The Cheating Cell. And it's a topic that comes up in a lot of different areas of my research on cooperation. Kind of how do you maintain a cooperative system in the face of cheating?
Can you define what cancer is and how does it cheat?
Yeah, so defining cancer, it really depends on who you ask. In the clinic, cancer is very often defined as a situation where you have a growth that is invading other tissues and or becoming metastatic. So it's defined in the clinic kind of based on the way that it manifests in terms of those invasion and metastasis phenomena. But when we take a sort of broader perspective on cancer that's not just limited to sort of the clinical approach, what we see is that cancer cells have these properties of replicating and not committing cell suicide when they should, so they don't apoptose when they are damaged. And they also overuse resources and they don't really take care of the environment around them. So all of these things are characteristics of cancer cells that we see, not just in humans, not just in the clinic, but much more broadly across really all forms of multicellular life. So this cheating framework is really a new way of kind of defining cancer and looking at cancer that allows us to really look across species.
Great. Can you tell us a little bit about how long cancer has been around?
Yeah, well, so what I was saying before about how cancer is really a breakdown of cellular cooperation in our bodies, well, that cellular cooperation began at the origins of multicellularity. So multicellular life has been around for 500 million years to a billion years. And it has evolved all of these methods and mechanisms for cellular cooperation. But once you have these groups of cells that are cooperating, so if you sort of imagine, back to the origins of multicellularity, it was just this teeming soup of primordial soup, right, with cells that are replicating and using resources, and then you get a cluster, right, and the cluster starts to cooperate, share resources, maybe have some mechanisms for holding back their division so that they can be a functional unit. Once you start having that cooperation, you actually open up the possibility for cheating to evolve as well. And so that creates a situation where cells can essentially take advantage of the cooperation in the cluster. What that means is basically that at the beginnings of multicellularity, when cellular cooperation came on the scene, that's also when the first cancers emerged. And life since the sort of very beginnings of multicellularity has evolved with this potential threat of cancerous cells or cheating cells in its midst.
We think of cancer as something that ultimately kills its host. And so how can that be? If cancer would kill the person or the being that has it, how does that get selected for evolutionarily?
That's a really great question. And the short answer is that cancer still exists because evolution is happening on two different levels. One level is the cellular level inside the body. And so that happens over the course of our lifetimes. Another level is evolution happening on the population of organisms. So if you look at how evolution is operating on organisms, it's selecting for organisms that are better at suppressing cancer and surviving to reproductive age, and at least in humans, beyond reproductive age, because we have a lot of parental care. So your fitness is enhanced if you don't get cancer, right? If you survive and successfully reproduce. But on the level of the population of cells inside each of our bodies, evolution is also happening. And the evolution among those cells inside our bodies actually favors cells that are taking advantage of the cooperation that's happening among all the cells in our body. And you have a sort of tension between these two levels where evolution is taking place. So evolution among organisms is selecting for, bodies that are good at suppressing cancer. But then during the lifetime of every individual, there is selection within them for those cells that are actually good at exploiting their hosts. So there's this sort of tension between these two levels. And the reason that we still get cancer is because our cancer suppression mechanisms that evolved through evolution happening in populations of organisms haven't been strong enough to completely eliminate cancer. And there's also some trade-offs actually that come with suppressing cancer. And so if we look across species, we can see that sometimes certain traits that are good for fitness, even at the level of the organism, can trade off with cancer. So for example, in dogs that are taller, larger, they also have higher cancer risk. And even in humans, taller humans have slightly higher cancer risk. So, being larger can be a good thing for your fitness, but it can also sometimes come with trade-offs. So there's a sort of balancing act as well, where, if you would, as an organism, completely suppress cancer, that could have a potentially negative effect on some other traits that otherwise would be good for your fitness.
Yeah, you use the example or the analogy of a tightrope walker expressing this kind of balance idea. And I think it was healing of a wound versus cell proliferation was one of the examples of kind of this balance of you want something to have enough. Well, I'll let you explain it.
Yeah. So I really like this metaphor of sort of walking a tightrope where on one side, you have to make sure that you're having enough cell proliferation to grow, to heal, to reproduce. But then on the other side, you have to make sure that you're not having so much replication that you essentially risk succumbing to cellular cheating in the form of cancer. And so if you think about what all of our cells are doing just on a day-to-day basis, they're expressing genes, and then we have production of all these proteins, some of which contribute to things like helping our wounds heal more quickly. And others are doing things like helping our cells monitor if they have DNA damage and shutting the cells down if they're too damaged. So I like to think about, all of us sort of walking this tightrope where we've got buckets, one bucket on each side, and they're filling with these products from genes. And, some of them are enhancing our cells' replication rates and sort of growth, and others are essentially trying to rein those in so that we don't have so much that we have a problem with cancer cells proliferating. So it is kind of this balancing act. And I really like the wound healing example because I think it's pretty intuitive and straightforward. So if you think about what it takes for cells to heal a wound, they have to proliferate and they also have to move. And so if you want to sort of, in quotes, want to, as an organism, be able to heal quickly, you have to have cells that are able to proliferate and move. But if you have cells that do that too much or not in the right contexts, then that can increase your risk of cancer because the cells are proliferating, which can lead to, growth of a tumor, and moving, which can lead to invasion and metastasis. So some of the characteristics of cells that otherwise can help us survive can sometimes end up being a liability with making us more at risk for cancer.
Another one of the examples you used for this kind of push and pull effect or the tightrope walker was the maternal versus paternal genes in the womb and as the fetus is developing. And you described the milkshake model to just talk about that. Would you explain what that is and how those two, the maternal and paternal genes compete?
Yeah, well, so this is part of a really fascinating area of theoretical evolutionary biology called parent-offspring conflict. It all ends up kind of coming from the fact that in each of us, we have genes from our mothers and genes from our fathers. And believe it or not, they don't actually fully cooperate to make us viable organisms. There is conflict between the genes from your mom and the genes from your dad, especially while you are in the womb developing as a fetus. So if we all sort of, rewind to our very earliest days as human beings, or the months that we spent in our mother's womb, the genes that we got inherited from our mom and the genes we inherited from our dad were sort of battling out in an epic fight over how we would develop. And to understand why that's the case, we kind of need to put on our evolutionary lenses a little bit, because it turns out that in species that are not entirely monogamous, so where you might have offspring that are half siblings, you end up not actually having totally aligned interests between the mother and father about how much to invest in each offspring. And from the maternal perspective, the mother and the mother's genes in this case, so from a sort of evolutionary perspective on what the genes are doing, the mother's, quote, interests are really about how to invest in the current offspring and any existing offspring and future offspring in a relatively equal way. So sort of, invest in the same amount in all of the present, future, existing offspring. But the paternal genes, on the other hand, they actually are under selection to have, to essentially extract more resources from the maternal body than what's optimal for the mother. Because from the father's evolutionary perspectives, he can have offspring with others as well, right? And so if you have non-monogamy, it creates this really interesting situation where essentially you have conflicting interests between the maternal and the paternal genes. So now if we sort of think about this milkshake metaphor, which I love because, anybody who has a sibling, you can, imagine your mom buys a milkshake and you have, say you have 3 siblings and there's 3 straws on that milkshake. Well, if you give that milkshake to the oldest and then the second oldest and then the youngest, by the time you get to the youngest, it's probably going to be empty, right? Because the first and second child will have sort of drank as much as they could from that milkshake. So you actually have this sort of conflict playing out inside the womb, just like you would if a mom got a milkshake for 3 kids and they had to consume it in cereal. So now if we kind of think about, well, what does all of this mean for cancer? It turns out that a lot of the ways that this conflict manifests inside the womb is that paternal genes are actually upregulating all of these factors that enhance the growth inside the womb and resource extraction from the mother. So basically, the paternal genes are sucking from the milkshake, if you'll sort of excuse my metaphor there, and the maternal genes are trying to restrain those growth factors so that the baby, so the fetus, grows more slowly. And you have this sort of tug of war between the paternal genes that are essentially trying to extract more resources from the mom, trying to suck down that milkshake, and the maternal genes that are sort of trying to constrain that. And what all of this means for cancer susceptibility is that this tug of war between maternal and paternal genes actually has substantial effects on gene expression for a lot of pathways that are involved in cancer, having to do with cell proliferation, for example. So there are so many different levels and ways that evolution has shaped our cancer susceptibility, including this sort of, battle that's going on inside the womb between the maternal genes and the paternal genes.
I just want to follow up on that a little bit. Does that mean that people who have more kids, the more likely the younger kids are to have cancer, or am I misunderstanding the analogy?
No, it's really all of the sort of effects that the maternal-paternal conflict, that battle has on cancer susceptibility, that's kind of baked into just our physiology now because of previous evolution that has happened. So I don't know of any evidence that there are differences in cancer risk with birth order.
Speaking as a younger child, I'm glad to hear that. So I want to talk about some transmissible cancers. You talk about in the book how that in dogs and Tasmanian devils and I think clams, there is evidence of cancers that can be transmitted from one animal to the other. Can you talk a little bit about that? And are they common? And do they happen in humans?
Yeah, so thankfully, transmissible cancers are very rare in humans. There are a few examples, but pretty much they're in situations where people are really immune compromised. And there are also a few that happen during pregnancy. So twins, sometimes there can be leukemias that start in one twin and then transfer to the other within the womb. But by and large, humans, thankfully, are pretty immune to contagious cancers, it seems. But there are some really interesting cases of contagious cancer in other species. So you've probably heard about the Tasmanian devil facial tumor. So Tasmanian devils are these very pugnacious, sort of adorable, but very violent and aggressive little creatures that essentially bite each other's faces just in, quote, normal social interaction. So they're really quite zombie-like. I like to think of them because it's their main mode of interaction is kind of to fight and try to bite each other's faces. But they have a really unfortunate disease, the Tasmanian devil facial tumor, which is essentially a growth that will happen on their faces that is composed of cancer cells. And then oftentimes when they have these aggressive interactions, little pieces of the tumor will actually flake off and then take root in the wounds of their counterparts. And then those cells that sort of flake off will grow in the wounds of their previous fighting partners, for example. And so it's because of this face-biting behavior, really, that this contagious cancer has spread very dramatically among Tasmanian devils. And for a while, there was a worry that it was going to really threaten their survival as a species. But thankfully, it looks like that they're okay, that they will survive, but it's still a really serious issue for the populations of Tasmanian devils. And in fact, there's not just one of these cell lines of contagious cancers among them, but there's actually two. So there's been two separate origins of this contagious cancer among Tasmanian devils. So they seem particularly vulnerable to actually having these contagious cancers arise and then spread.
You also talked about dogs having a sexually transmitted cancer. And that is, if I remember correctly, that is basically due to small wounds in the genital area and just transmitting between the two. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's a sexually transmitted cancer. So it's kind of similar in a way to what happens with the Tasmanian devils, where you get areas in the wounds where cells from the other individual will sort of flake off and then take root and grow. That happens with the dog transmissible cancer as well, where during mating, very often you get these wounds that occur in the genital areas of dogs. And that provides this environment that is actually quite conducive to cancer cells growing. And this is actually a much broader phenomenon, that when you have areas that are wounded, essentially what you get is a more permissive environment for cells to proliferate and move around. And basically the body is kind of tolerating that proliferation and movement because that's necessary for wound healing, like in ideal circumstances, right? So it's an interesting kind of connection to our previous conversation about the trade-offs with wound healing. Because, if you have this wound healing system, you have to have a body that tolerates proliferation and tolerates cells moving around. And that can sometimes create this greater vulnerability to cancer, including in the cases of dogs and Tasmanian devils, transmissible cancers.
Just a little bit more about animals, because who doesn't like dogs? You mentioned earlier, and you go on at some length about this in the book, about how large dogs tend to get more cancer than smaller dogs. And you mentioned earlier that larger humans, there's a statistical more likelihood that they will get more cancer than smaller humans. And yet elephants don't get more cancer. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. So this is a really interesting phenomenon where, again, you kind of have different patterns really arising if you look within species versus if you look between species. So if we look within species, what we see is that very often larger organisms are more susceptible to cancer. But if we look among species, larger organisms often have more systems for suppressing cancer. So they may have cancer rates that are quite similar to, like, larger organisms can have rates that are similar to smaller organisms. Sometimes they even have much lower rates of cancer than smaller organisms. And that's because when you think about what's going on in terms of evolution at the level of how these different species are getting selected, basically for a very long-lived organism that doesn't reproduce until, a decade or two into its life, like, humans and elephants, there is selection for the ability to suppress cancer for a much longer time. Because if you don't, then you're an evolutionary dead end. So these characteristics of what we call life history strategies. So these are, when you reproduce, how large you grow, how many offspring you have, those kinds of factors actually then sort of feed back to influence the evolution of cancer defenses. And organisms that have these sort of longer time horizons essentially for reproduction, those species end up having more selection on cancer defenses, which can lead them to have lower rates of cancer. But within species, there isn't that much variation in cancer defenses. And so the vulnerability of being larger, you can actually see that if you look within species. But between or among species, you don't really see that because you have the evolution of these sort of compensatory mechanisms for suppressing cancer.
You also mentioned that people live with precancerous cells all the time. Can you tell us about that and what that means for our health?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think that there's almost a sense in our culture in the US that cancer is sort of this, disease that, you get it and it's like a black and white kind of thing, right? It's like you either have cancer or you don't. But the reality is that all of us have sort of precancerous patches of skin all over our bodies all the time. If you look down at your hand and you see, maybe you have a few little freckles or discolorations, like those are precancerous expansions of cells, but our bodies are able to keep those under control. And so they don't become cancer. And our whole lives are essentially this balancing act of getting these mutations that lead to sort of expansions of cells that have mutations that could lead to cancer, but then having other systems and mechanisms in the body that keep them from going out of control. So our whole lives, our bodies are essentially controlling and managing all of these precancerous growths all the time. And most of the time when you see cancer arise, it's really because there's been a failure of some of the systems for keeping the cells under control that are otherwise able to be kept under control. Now, it is true that the more mutations that cells get in really, critical areas that have to do with cellular cooperation and cellular cheating, that when they have more mutations, it's easier for them to evade all of our body's defenses against cancer. But it is much more of a sort of ongoing balancing act as opposed to just like a acute event like, black and white from, not having cancer to having cancer.
So related to that, let's say you have a small spot on your skin that is cancerous and then it takes hold and your body is not able to fight that off. How then does it metastasize throughout your body?
Well, metastasis is one of those great mysteries still. So there are no particular genes that are associated with metastasis. There are, a number of sort of cellular pathways that are often upregulated, meaning that there's, genes that get turned on and proteins that get created that you often see in metastasis. But we have not yet really solved the problem of why does metastasis happen? And I think that part of why metastasis remains such a mystery is because an evolutionary approach has not really fully been applied to it yet. It's one of the things that, I'm trying to do with my book is show what some of the potential benefits are to really applying an evolutionary approach to metastasis. I've worked on it some in my research. I looked at, in particular, invasion and how invasion happens. And invasion is often a precursor to metastasis. But it turns out that a lot of the same kinds of processes that occur in ecological systems are probably going on also in tumors because they are also ecological systems, even though the resources are different and instead of having animals, moving around and plants doing things, we have all sorts of different kinds of cells that are, consuming resources and doing things. But if we look at this from an evolutionary perspective and from an ecological perspective, it becomes clear that one of the reasons why you get movement, so if it's, dispersal of organisms in environments, or if it's cells moving in a tumor and invading into new tissues, that there's actually a really important relationship with the ecosystem and the ecology. So for example, I created a model where I looked at how the availability of resources, so in the case of cancer, that's essentially oxygen, glucose in the blood, how that influences selection on cells to move or not. And what we saw in this model is that having cells that are over-consuming resources, it actually then changes the environment in a way that selects for cells that move more. So there's this really important relationship between cheating in terms of overusing resources and then the evolutionary and ecological consequences of that can actually lead to selection for cells that move more, cells that then could be invading and then, potentially also metastasizing from that point. So that's just one example of kind of how an evolutionary and cooperation theory approach can be used to look at metastasis differently. In my book, I also talk about, how we really should be taking seriously the prospect that selection is favoring cancer cells that can cooperate with each other in order to be more effective at metastasizing. And I think exploring that in greater depth may be a really important piece of the puzzle to trying to solve the mysteries of metastasis that still exist.
So I really enjoyed your book, and it gives a really interesting and thorough explanation for how cancer works and how it has evolved. But I feel like the last chapter is the most exciting, and it's how to control cancer. And you talk about some different theories of how to do that, such as integrated pest management, using that as an example. Can you talk about some of the other ways that people are thinking about treating cancer?
Yeah. So the example of integrated pest management is, I think, a really great one. So this is an approach that was really translated into cancer biology by Bob Gatenby at Moffitt Cancer Center. He essentially saw what was going on in terms of how farmers were controlling populations of pests by essentially not using the highest levels of chemicals, but instead using just enough to keep the populations under control. And the advantage to this, to not using the highest possible doses of chemicals, is that if you do use the highest doses, you end up selecting for those pests that are resistant to the chemicals that you're using to try to keep them under control. And this is the exact same problem that we face in treating cancers, that when you use high dose chemotherapy, what ends up happening is that cells that are resistant to those treatments end up being the only ones that survive at the end. And so Bob Gatenby saw this parallel and realized that there was an opportunity to take some of these principles from integrated pest management and apply them to cancer. So he pioneered an approach which is called adaptive therapy, which essentially doses individuals with chemotherapy only when their tumors are growing. And when the tumors are stable, it basically leaves them alone. And there's some alternative protocols where you can increase the dose if it's growing and decrease the dose if it's staying stable. So that the exact algorithm can differ a little bit depending on the study. But the main idea is that you basically just try to keep the tumor at a stable size rather than trying to eradicate it. And so you keep it at this stable size, but you also keep it in a state where it is sensitive to the therapy that you're trying to use. So that when you do give the chemotherapy, you're able to keep that tumor under control. If you use such a high dose that you select just for the cells that are resistant, then you lose the ability to use that chemotherapy effectively over the long term. And so that's really the goal of adaptive therapy, is to kind of change the framing from how do we eradicate the tumor to how do we keep it under control so that patients can live as long as possible with maintaining that control over the tumor. So managing the cancer over the long term instead of just throwing the kitchen sink at it right away and then not really having a good, plan B or C or D once the tumor evolves resistance to all the therapies.
So it's more a method of managing a tumor, for example, rather than trying to eradicate it.
Exactly. Yeah. And now that doesn't mean that this is the right approach for every cancer. So some cancers, it's clear that we can actually eradicate them with high dose therapy. So, there's also some childhood cancers that are quite curable. So, it's not that we should completely throw out the idea of going for a cure, but we have to be a little bit smarter about assessing how likely it is that we will be able to achieve a cure with high dose therapy versus just selecting for a resistant tumor that's going to be much harder to treat in the future. So for those patients where it is going to be hard to eradicate the tumor, it makes a lot more sense to approach it from the perspective of, how do we increase the likelihood that that person will live for a longer time with the tumor under control, and maybe also with a better quality of life because they're not going to have as high dose of therapies that they'll have to deal with. So I think those are all really important things to consider as we are re-examining the way that we are treating cancer as a disease.
That sounds really hopeful to have more tools that we can potentially use. So for my final question, tell me about Zombified.
Oh, well, Zombified is my podcast. The tagline for it is your source for fresh brains. And it's sort of a triple entendre. So I interview new and fascinating people in every episode. So those are the fresh brains on the podcast. And there's also, of course, the zombie reference, right? So fresh brains are delicious if you're a zombie. And we also are somewhat playful and maybe a little irreverent sometimes, despite it being a science podcast.
Oh, no.
So we're fresh in that sense. So basically, this podcast is a way for me to have really interesting conversations with people about some of the questions I think are most important right now in science and in ethics and in society and technology. And it's all sort of framed around this question of what zombifies us. So what kind of takes over our brains, what influences us without us really having much awareness that we're being influenced, and what are the implications of that for science, for society, for how we live our daily lives. And we also talk about surviving the zombie apocalypse and how we can use science and cooperation among scholars to better deal with some of the challenges that we're facing that might be more or less apocalyptic. But we try to have fun with the whole thing, even though it is a very serious podcast in the sense that, we're very grounded in evolutionary biology and psychology. And we grapple with a lot of issues in, how we're being affected by technology and sometimes manipulated by it without knowing it. So it's just a lot of fun. And I realize I actually really love recording these episodes because I get to have conversations with some of the most interesting people I know. So it's a great excuse for me to have some fun and be nerdy, basically.
That sounds awesome. We will definitely put links to Zombified in the episode notes, and we'll link to you on our social media. So we will spread the good word.
Awesome. Thank you.
So I think that brings us to the end of this episode. I would like to thank Dr. Athena Aktipis for her information and explanation of her book, The Cheating Cell, How Evolution Helps Us Understand and Treat Cancer. Thank you for being here.
It was my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. You can find Athena's podcast Zombified in your favorite podcast app or click on the link that's included in our episode notes. It's fun and just might stretch your brain in some new ways. We obviously can't hold in-person events right now, but we still want to provide you with podcasts, and we have lots of interviews and talks in the queue. We're planning to keep them available at no cost, but we can only do that with your donations. People have been incredibly generous so far, and I want to say a heartfelt thank you to everyone who has already donated. We know a lot of people and organizations are struggling at the moment, and we don't want to take anything away from more urgent needs. However, if you like what we do and you're in a position to do so, we'd be grateful for donations of any size. There are 2 ways to donate. You can make a one-time donation through our nonprofit partner, Make You Think, or you can join our Patreon with perks like pint glasses and Science on Tap stickers. There are links in the episode notes for both of those donation options. Thanks to Sarah Henning Stout at Princeton for all of her support of what we do here. Also, a huge thanks to Chelsea Schuyler for her help with social media, marketing, and general science enthusiasm. If you're an individual or small business who needs a computer nerd with writing skills, I highly recommend her help with websites, blogs, and social media. I'll put a link to her website in the episode notes. Thanks to Graham Tully for sound production and for patience, and to Jonathan Coulton for the use of his song Mandelbrot Set for our theme music.
One badass fucking fractal, and you're just in time to save